Hello everyone, and welcome to the 8th installment of The Modern Hermeticist, a big history, and I'm your host, Dan Attrell. So, I've been reading a very interesting work lately entitled The Discovery of the Mind in Greek Philosophy and Literature by Bruno Snell, who is a German philologist. This book was written in the 1950s. It's a book about the tremendous changes which took place between the times of Homer and the time of Socrates. Since the Homeric period roughly corresponds to the period that we're discussing right now, I figured we should talk about some of the ideas presented in this work. The idea Snell presents, Eurocentric though it is that the very concept of man as an intellectual being, a being of science, of literature, a being of ethics, governed by reason or rationality, even a being of abstractions. This was an unprecedented concept, which, once it was discovered, if we can use that term, came around to decisively influence all subsequent iterations of European thinking. It was in this period, the Iron Age, that men became self-aware as thinkers endowed with something that today we call mind, consciousness. This work is a monument, old though it may be, in the history of ideas, what the Germans call Geistesgeschichte, the history of spirit or mind or ideas. This is the branch of history which I'm most interested in. Some historians are more inclined toward material culture. That is to say, they enjoy digging through potsherds and old buildings, artifacts, these sorts of things. Other historians are interested in questions of economics or trade or politics. My chief interest, though all of these things are, of course, interconnected, my chief interest is in the history of ideas, in the history of how people perceive the world around them. Because we take this for granted. We assume that once the hardware of our human brains was developed, that somehow the software came into effect simultaneously. And this is certainly not the case. We can't even really conceive of how people thought, even just as far back as the Iron Age. Though we can try. And it's a valuable exercise. It's a valuable practice in, I would say, let's call it psychedelic history, a mind-manifesting history. Because that's literally what we're talking about right now. So, as Europeans, or at least as Anglophones, or people who speak English, our way of thinking goes straight back to Greece. Their conceptions of the world, let's say if ideas were water, would make up the ocean that we as Anglophones are locked in. Their mind is the ocean in which we all swim. Their way of thinking is our only way of thinking. The Romans inherited Greek thought. They did this by conquering Greece and taking many of its educated people as house slaves to educate their children. Much in the way, let's say, that it is a status symbol for a wealthy American to have an English butler, it was very fashionable and chic for Roman aristocrats to have a house full of Greek slaves, especially educated slaves who took care of their children. So, with the Roman inheritance of Greek thought, they passed that on through the institution of the Church, the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church as well, of course, into the Middle Ages. Things like Platonism and Aristotelianism were two highly competitive philosophies in the universities of the Middle Ages, especially Aristotelianism. It wasn't until the Renaissance that Platonism would have some sort of resurrection, though, of course, we can't escape Platonism within the context of Christianity, because Christianity is a thoroughly Platonic religion. Without Plato, there would be no Christianity. Of that, I am 100% positive. Obviously, Islam had a large part to play in the transmission of Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy. I don't even really like talking about Islam in its role as a transmitter because it's Eurocentric. It assumes that the role of Islam was solely to hold on to this knowledge, to protect it until it could be expounded upon by the scholastic philosophers of the West. This is nonsense. I mean, the Islamic philosophers of the Middle Ages far outshined Europe's philosophers, and much of the commentary on Aristotle, which had value to Europeans, had been discussed in the Islamic world previously, sometimes hundreds of years previously. I don't even like to distinguish the Islamic world from the so-called West. This is an artificial dichotomy. It's a dichotomy that starts with Homer and then is stressed by Herodotus and has really only gotten out of hand since then. The Islamic world are inheritors to the Greek world just as much, if not even more so, than we are. So, in that regard, Islamic society and culture is distinctly Western, if we even have to use this word, which is completely arbitrary. Where does West end and East begin? Anybody who will give you an answer to this is drawing upon totally arbitrary lines of division, as most lines of division are. In any case, the Renaissance stressed classical Greek values above medieval Christian ones, which are in and of themselves also a form of Greek values. The Enlightenment recapitulated this love of the rational, this love of reason that was so stressed by classical Greek philosophy. Our obsession with things like truth, what the Greeks called aletheia, what the Latins call veritas, this idea of things which have undergone the formality of happening in consensus reality, that these can now be measured because they've undergone that formality. That this somehow has more value than what's going on in all of our heads. Truth. Our obsession with it, as it stands at the heart of science and philosophy, this is a historical development. It arose in a very specific intellectual climate, a very specific political, social, and economic climate, which we've been talking about. This was a climate which was alien to the period of time immediately after the Bronze Age collapse, to the world of Homer. Now, I should mention, since we're going to be talking about Homer a fair deal, Homer is not a real person. There never was a blind bard named Homer who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer represents a tradition. Homer is more of an artistic movement of bards. Homer was male and female. Many poets in the ancient Greek world were females. Entertainment was something that often fell within the domain of women. Sappho is a famous Greek poet from the Lyric period, which came slightly after the Homeric period. So for us to imagine what it would be like to think like a so-called Dark Age Greek, to think like a Homer, a Homeric poet, we need to look at their texts, because that's all that survives to us. And we need to look at it through their own eyes as best as possible. Now, when we read the Iliad or the Odyssey, even if we read it in the original Greek, we, or at least I, metastasize the words. I don't read Homer in Greek as a Greek would read it. I translate internally in my head the Greek words into English words, and then construct the meaning based on my internal English translation. We retro-project our own views of the world onto characters, our own emotions, our own thought processes. And this, in a way, is not the best thing, because the works of Homer are very emotional. We're quick to forget how radically different Homer's experience would have been from our own. Remember, the human hardware hasn't changed in 200,000 years, but the software is constantly shifting. So we need to realize that quote-unquote thinking among the Greeks actually came about as a radical revolution. They didn't just map out new subjects for discussion, they literally discovered the human mind. This was a novel unfoldment, which we can see happening in the records. We see it developing throughout various literary genres. This drama of man's gradual discovery of himself, as far as Europe is concerned, can be traced through the changes in epic, the poems of Homer and Hesiod, in lyric poetry, the works of Alcaeus and Sappho, and drama, the works of playwrights from the Athenian classical age, such as Sophocles, Aeschylus, and my personal favorite, Euripides. So, this discovery of the intellect, it didn't come about like the discovery of a new continent. North America, as a landmass, existed long before anyone set foot on it, and the mind is different. It exists as a sort of feedback loop, a feedback loop of self-awareness. If you aren't familiar with the concept of feedback, take a microphone, plug it into an amplifier, make a sound in the microphone and then try to catch that sound coming out of the amplifier back into the mic. It will very quickly create a feedback loop, which sounds awful and increases in loudness as the feedback loop keeps sustaining itself. I've got an amp right here, and I can demonstrate what this sounds like. Let me show you. Now, the human mind, the intellect, consciousness, works a lot like this. It emerges by grace of man's cognizance of himself. The intellect wasn't invented like a tool or a method to deal with a problem. There was no objective or aim involved with the discovery of the intellect. It existed before it was discovered, it just wasn't perceived in the same way. If there's a guitar in the forest creating a feedback loop and there's no one there to hear it, does it really make a sound? The answer is no, because a sound is something that is perceived. It has to make contact with a tympanic membrane, which is then converted into electrical signals in the brain in order for it to actually constitute a sound. Otherwise, it's just vibrations emanating outward and eventually dissipating. Imagine a man who his whole life used his knife to cut food and rope and these sorts of utilitarian practices. And then all of a sudden, he realizes that he can use this knife and jab it into another man. This changes his entire conception of the object. There's all sorts of weird transformations in consciousness dotting history. Two I can think of, off the top of my head, are perspective in art. That was a great aha moment. Another one was the introduction of linear thought, which was essentially brought about by print. People in the Middle Ages and beforehand had much more scattered and divergent, let's say, tree-like thoughts. This was before everything had to be neatly plugged in and organized on a printing press. Manuscripts were a veritable clusterfuck, for a lack of a better term. There were comments in the margins, and there were comments on those comments, and you could read a work without necessarily having to start from the first page. It took a long time for people to start caring about things like standardized script, and this influenced a movement towards linear, logical thinking. So the discovery of the mind is one of these strange emergences. We should say rather that instead of having been discovered in our contemporary usage of the word, the mind was unveiled. It had a costume covering it, and it was eventually stripped of that costume. In any case, we shouldn't get too hung up on these semantic issues. There are metaphysical implications to these questions as to whether the mind was discovered or uncovered or revealed, but we needn't get into them here. So, although we're saying that the intellect was not discovered until the time of Homer, it's obvious that Homer conceived of the thing which we call the intellect in a different way. So, in this sense, the intellect existed for Homer as well, but not in the way that it is understood today. The way Homer understood the intellect can't be grasped in our speech because language has its own interpretations fixed into them by the words we use. When we want to explain a thought that was recorded in another language, we come to the conclusion that the foreign word means this word, that X means Y, but also it means Y minus Z. You have to adjust the word by adding or subtracting other ideas. So, for example, auctoritas is a great Roman concept. It's a Latin word. It's the word from which we get authority. But it doesn't have the same sense that authority has. Auctoritas is an intrinsic authority within a person that other people can see and that they want to adhere to. Whereas authority in English is simply something that must be followed by threat of punishment. Now, notice this. I give the two words, they sound pretty much the same, authority, auctoritas, and yet I have to qualify where these differ from one another. When we try to reproduce alien thoughts in our own tongue, and that's essentially what scholarship is, we have a choice of either resigning ourselves to vague improvisations or finding certain approximations and then subtracting from them where they fail to correspond. This is a negative approach, but it's really our only hope at understanding concepts in different languages. In any case, we don't have to be exceptionally skeptical, especially when it comes to Greek, because Greek lies at the foundation of our intellectual past. So in what I'm about to talk about, I'm not saying Homer's characters, insofar as they didn't have an intellect or a soul, as we conceive of it now, that these people weren't capable of joy or self-reflection or whatnot. I'm just saying that they didn't conceive of these things as actions of the intellect or actions of a soul. And so, in this sense, they didn't know about the two. Obviously, there was something which occupied that place, but to say that it is either the intellect or the soul is to retro-project our concepts. Okay, so since the time of Aristarchus, who was a great Alexandrian grammarian, it's been the rule among philologists, that is, people who work with ancient and classical texts, not to allow themselves to be influenced by the usage of words of a later generation when investigating Homeric speech. So, if a certain word meant something in Koine, or common Greek, that was popular during the time of Aristarchus, we shouldn't assume that that word meant the same thing a good 800 years prior. This would be like assuming that our English is the exact same as Shakespeare's English. So we need to look at Homer and his or her works on their own terms. When we grasp words with this kind of precision, we suddenly discover all of their ancient splendor. A grammarian can be like a restorer of an old painting. They can scrape off dust. They can remove varnish, which centuries have caked onto the original work, and draw out the original brilliance of the work. We can do this with words. So the more carefully we distinguish between the meanings of Homer's words and those of classical Greece, which is the Greek that most people study, the clearer the gulf between these two periods appears. Once we take note of this gulf between the Homeric period and the classical period, we can take note of the changes which occurred gradually between these two periods. So, to illustrate this, you'll have to forgive me, but we're going to have to delve into a couple of Greek verbs and look at how Homer conceived of these verbs, and then how we translate them. So these verbs, most of them denote the operation of sight, are horan, idein, lausein, athrein, theasthai, skeptesthai, osesthai, derkesthai, and paptanen. Now these are all infinitives. To see is how we would render them in English. So of these, most stopped being used in classical Greek, notably derkesthai, lausein, osesthai, and paptainen. There are two words which survive well after Homer's time, and these are blepein and theorein. The words that were discarded are an indicator that the older language recognized certain needs or expressed certain modalities of thinking which were no longer felt by later Greeks. So, for example, derkesthai, which we translate in English as to see, actually means, in its original form, to have a particular look in one's eye. This is related to the word drakon, where we get dragon, on account of the look in their eye, the look of a serpent. So, the snake is called the seeing one, not because he can see particularly well, but because his stare commands attention. So by the same token, Homer's derkesthai refers not so much to the function of the eye as to its gleam as noticed by another person. This is why the verb is used when talking about the mythical creature, the Gorgon, whose glance turns people to stone. Derkesthai means to look with a specific expression. This presents us with a suggestive image of a certain attitude of the eyes, just as in our language the words to glare or to gaze describe a particular type, though not the same type, of looking. So, for example, we can say that an eagle derketai, he looks very sharply. And so, whereas in English, this sharply would characterize the function and the capacity of the visual organ that, this eagle can see very far, Homer has in mind the beams of the eagle's eye. Beams that penetrate like rays of the sun. beams that act like pointed weapons. They cut through things. So, the Homeric didakasthai doesn't designate the proper objective of sight. It doesn't designate the function of the eye, which is to transmit sense impressions to human perception. It designates the look in a person's eye, the surface appearance, the qualia of a person's sight, as perceived by another, not by the person themselves, doing the seeing. So, the same is true of another verb, which has disappeared, and this is paptainen. This is also a mode of looking. It means looking about inquisitively, carefully, or with fear. So, like didakasthai, it denotes a visual attitude. It doesn't hinge on the function of sight itself. Neither of these words, didakasthai or paptainen, are ever found in the first person. A person notices these types of seeing in others rather than ascribing them to himself. Another verb, to see, lauso, behaves differently. Etymologically, it's connected with the word laukos, which means gleaming or white, and most cases of this word's use in the Iliad pertain to fire and shining weapons. So the meaning is plainly to see something bright. It also means to let one's eyes travel. Lauso connotes a certain sensation experienced in the act of seeing, especially seeing certain bright objects. So again, this term derives its special significance from a mode of seeing, not the function of sight itself. It derives its significance from the object seen. This is also true of another verb which I mentioned, osasthai. It means to have an impression, especially to have a threatening impression. So, as in previous instances, the seeing is determined by the object and the attending sentiment. These are just a couple of examples. Theasthai, where we get the word theater, comes from the idea of looking on with your mouth gaping open. We might say, to stare. Eventually, many of these words were combined to form the principal parts of the verb to see. Oran, idein, opsesthai, and this shows that there was no one verb to refer to the function of sight as such. There were rather several verbs, each designating a specific type of vision. So to sum up, the verbs of the early period take their cue from palpable aspects. They take their cue from the external qualifications of the act of seeing, while later on, it is the essential function itself, the operation common to every glance, that determines the content of the verb. So, in later periods, various kinds of sight are modified by inserting adverbs or prepositions. So obviously, even in Homer, men use their eyes to see, that is, to receive optical impressions, but nobody took decisive interest in what we today justly regard as the basic function, the objective essence of sight. And so if they didn't have a word for it, it follows that as far as they were concerned, it didn't exist. Language defines the contours of our reality. This is a theme that George Orwell played with extensively in his work 1984, where the government attempts to simplify language as a means to control the mind. This certainly is happening today. It has always happened. So what about the body? Aristarchus, the Alexandrian grammarian, was the first to notice in Homer that the word soma, which subsequently came to mean body, is never used with reference to a living being. A soma is a corpse. By the way, this has no etymological link to the soma of the Rig Veda, which we talked about in earlier sessions. It's just a mere coincidence. So then how does Homer refer to a body? Aristarchus believed that for Homer, the word demas was the live body. And that's true in certain cases. But demas is a poor substitute for body because the word only occurs in the accusative of specification. So that's a fancy way to say it means in structure or in shape, with respects to form. So our phrase, his body became feeble, would be the Homeric lelunto guia. His limbs were relaxed. Another example, his whole body trembled, would appear as guia tromeontai, where we might say sweat poured from his body. Homer has hydros ek meleon erein. His body was filled with strength, is pleisten darahoi meleentos alkes. So here we have plurals where our linguistic tradition would lead us to expect the singular. So instead of body, Homer says limbs. Guia are the limbs as moved by the joints. Melea are the limbs in their muscular strength. So the limbs are the essence of a man's body. This is a very different conception from the modern vision of a man, who is certainly not his limbs. So what are some other ways of rendering the word body? How would we translate, he washed his body? Homer says, kroa nitseto. Or let's say, the sword pierced his body. Here he says, xifos kroos dielte. So on the basis of passages like these, some have argued that kroos, or kros, is the equivalent of body rather than skin. There's no doubt that kros is the skin, not the skin as an anatomical substance. The skin which can be peeled off, that's derma. It's the same derma in dermatologist. But kros refers to the skin as a surface, as the outer circumference of the figure of a man. So kros is often used in the place of a body. So perikroi dousetocalcon means he placed his armor about his body, or literally, he wrapped it around his skin. We in the modern day find it difficult to conceive of a mentality which made no provision for the body as such. This happened over time. the development of a self, the development of an individual, of an ego, and then the association between the body and the self. We take these things for granted, but they're actually historical developments. Early Greek art actually corroborates this impression that the physical body of man was not understood as a unit, but as an aggregate. It wasn't until the classical art of the 5th century that we find attempts to depict the body as an organic unit whose parts are mutually correlated. In the preceding period, the body was a mere construct of independent limbs variously put together. The pictures of human beings from the time of Homer are like primitive drawings which children draw. Though, in order for them to draw these figures, they would just add a bunch of limbs together. Our children, however, tend to represent these human shapes as a body with limbs attached to it. So a little pictogram from a geometric phase pot would have a figure with a head on top of some broad shoulders with some arms attached to them, really big quads and big calves and feet. There's no real body to speak of. A modern child draws a circle which makes up the body, a circle for the head, and then little stick figures for arms and legs. The body, to a Greek, was nothing but melea kai guia, an aggregate of limbs. Early Greek drawing wanted to demonstrate the agility of a human figure. The drawing of a modern child wants to depict compactness and unity. It's the depiction of an individual rather than an aggregate of limbs. So, the early Greeks didn't grasp the body as a unit. They didn't do this in their language, and they didn't do it in their visual arts. The phenomenon is the same as with the verbs of denoting sight. The activity is first understood in terms of its conspicuous modes, its modes which can be perceived by others. The essential function of the activity, something like sight itself, as it is expressed in consciousness, it doesn't exist. No one is talking about it. So, Snell writes, and I'll quote him directly, "It seems then as if language aims progressively to express the essence of an act, but is at first unable to comprehend it, because it is a function, and as such, neither tangibly apparent, nor associated with certain unambiguous emotions. As soon, however, as it is recognized and has received a name, it has come into existence, and the knowledge of its existence quickly becomes common property. Concerning the body, the chain of events may have been somewhat like this. In the early period, a speaker, when faced by another person, was apparently satisfied to call out his name. This is Achilles, or to say, this is a man. As a next step, the most conspicuous elements of his appearance are described, namely, his limbs as existing side by side. Their functional correlation is not apprehended in its full importance until somewhat later. True enough, the function is a concrete fact, but its objective existence does not manifest itself so clearly as the presence of the individual corporeal limbs, and its prior significance escapes even the owner of the limbs himself. With the discovery of this hidden unity, of course, it is at once appreciated as an immediate and self-explanatory truth. This objective truth, one must admit, doesn't exist for a man until it's seen and known and designated by a word. Once this has happened, it's become an object of thought. So, obviously, the Homeric man had a body exactly like later Greeks, but he understood it merely as the sum total of his limbs. Soma, as body, in the way that we understand it, is a later interpretation. This is why, again and again, Homer speaks of fast legs, of knees in speedy motion, of sinewy arms. It's why verbs of sight refer back to the motion or the look in the eyes. Okay, so in as far as the intellect and the soul is concerned, we find this same thing going on. Homer has no word to describe the mind or the soul. Psyche, the word for soul in later Greek, has no original connection with the thinking or feeling soul. This is more so the human life force, the spiritus. It's the thing that keeps you alive. So there's a gap in Homeric vocabulary. This is a gap that's comparable to the deficiency in physical terminology that we just discussed. Now, this gap was filled with a number of other words which don't possess the same center of gravity as the modern terms, but which cover more or less the same area. So, insofar as the soul is concerned, the most important words are psyche, or psyche in English, thumos, in English we would spell this Thymos, and nous, which we render as mind today. But again, this is a metathesis. So concerning psyche, Homer says that when a man dies, it flutters away and it goes down to Hades, like a bat. Nevertheless, from this, it's pretty much impossible to figure out what he thinks that psyche does during a man's lifetime. Homer says very little about the psyche of the living. All we know is that it leaves its owner when he's dying, or when he loses consciousness. He says that psyche is risked in battle. One fights for it, one wishes to save his psyche, and so on. So maybe it's best that we should translate psyche as just life, even though that's not really its true meaning. When it comes to psyche departing from the body, Homer mentions very few details. He says it leaves through the mouth, it is breathed forth. This is why I called it spiritus earlier on, which is spirit or breath. It can also leave through a wound, and then it flies down to Hades. There it lives a ghost-like existence as a specter or an image, an eidolon, of the deceased person. So this vital breath of existence was a semi-concrete organ which existed in a man as long as he lived. As to its location or its function, Homer passes over them in silence. And that means that we can't really know about what he or she believed the psyche really was. So the other two words for the mind are thumos and nous. Thumos, which in classical Greek, remember this is much later, would come to mean essentially the heart as the seat of emotions. In Homer, it's the generator of motion or agitation. Nous is the cause of ideas and images. So all mental phenomena are distributed in one way or another so as to fall in the sphere of either of these two organs, the thumos or the nous. In several passages, death is depicted as a departure of the thumos, with the result that scholars have attempted to interpret thumos as soul. So, the thumos left his bones is a phrase which occurs 7 times. Quickly, the thumos went forth from the limbs is found twice. So, if we translate thumos as the organ of motion, or of emotion, the matter becomes fairly simple. Since this organ determines physical motion, it's plausible enough to say that at the point of death, the thumos leaves the bones and the mele, the limbs. This, however, hardly implies that the thumos continues to exist after death. It just means that which provided motion is now gone. So, an interesting fact is that animals which die are never described as having psyches, whereas they possess thumos. So a man has both thumos and psyche, but an animal does not. This, of course, just adds to the confusion between the two terms. These two not yet interchangeable terms. So, whereas the contrast between thumos and psyche is clear, the line between thumos and nous is not so clear. So, if thumos is the mental organ which causes motion or emotion, the nous is the recipient of images. It's, let's say, in charge of intellectual matters, whereas the thumos is in charge of emotional matters. We could maybe call this the left and the right brain in modern day parlance. But, of course, there's overlap between the two of these things. We say that the head is the seat of thinking and the heart is the seat of feeling. But this doesn't stop us from saying that he carries thoughts of his beloved in his heart. One can have thoughts in their heart. One can have emotions in their mind. So the same is true of thumos and nous. Nous is akin to the infinitive verb knowing, and these are related, and that just means to realize. Sometimes we translate it as to see. More particularly, it refers to the act of acquiring a clear image of something. So nous, as it were, is the mental eye, which exercises unclouded vision. So the word exceeds the competence of our words, mind or intelligence or soul, and the same is true of thumos as well. If someone says they feel something in their thumos, the reference is to an organ which we can translate as soul, provided we keep in mind that it is the soul as the seat of emotions, and not the soul as the seat of the intellect. But then thumos can also mean will. So what's all this got to do with Homer's attitude toward the human mind? At first, it seems like the thumos and the nous are no more than parts of the soul, which we know from Plato's psychology. But those parts, those presuppose a psychic whole of which Homer had, no understanding of. Thumos, nous, and psyche are all separate organs, each with their own function. So, for example, we say to look at a thing with different eyes without actually meaning that, we need to look at them with different physical eyeballs. The word eye stands for the function of the eye, or vision, and what we actually mean is to see a different view. Homer's thumos has to be similarly understood. It serves numerous functions. Organs and functions in Homer's time hadn't yet been correlated and then divided into strict categories. Some people have thought that because Homer had, quote-unquote, not yet acquired the knowledge of these things, they believe that this lowered his stature as a poet. They tried to explain away the differences between his or her mentality and ours by the proposition that Homer stylized his thinking, and that it was for aesthetic reasons that he avoided the description of mental processes, because these kinds of details might have detracted from a grand simplicity of his heroes. I don't think that it's conceivable that Homer could have deliberately turned his back on the notions of the intellect or the soul. This kind of finesse in discrimination can't be attributed to an ancient epic poet. And then when you start looking at the gaps left by Homer's alleged ignorance, there's suddenly a meaningful pattern that modern concepts are left out and ancient ones stay. Obviously, there's some deliberate stylization going on in Homer, but this isn't the quarters where they're taking effect. The belief in the existence of a universal, of a uniform human mind, is a modern rationalist prejudice. So the first writer who would actually feature this new concept of a soul is Heraclitus. He calls the soul of living man psyche, psyche, and in his view, man consists of both a body and a soul. And the soul is endowed with qualities which differ from those of the body and its physical organs. These sorts of new qualities were irreconcilable with the categories of Homer's thought. He didn't even have the same linguistic prerequisites to describe what Heraclitus would call the soul. It was the period of lyric poetry which stands between Homer and Heraclitus which would provide him with this toolkit. The lyric poets were the first to voice this new idea that intellectual and spiritual matters have some sort of depth. Archaic poetry contains many words like bathuthron, deep pondering, or bathumetes, deep thinking. Concepts like deep knowledge, deep thinking, deep pondering, these become common in the Archaic period, in the period that we're essentially at now in our history. We talked about lyric poetry in our last session, at least briefly. So what's meant in these expressions is a symbol of depth that points toward an infinity that is present in intellectual and spiritual matters, but that does not exist in the physical sphere. Homeric speech doesn't really understand this aspect of the word deep. We can't delve into the subconscious, which wouldn't be figured out until the 20th century, until we even have a basic understanding of regular conscience. Homer thought more in terms of quantity than intensity. So, for example, the word polytropon, which is in the first line of the Odyssey, means much skilled. Someone who exhibits skillfulness or usefulness often. Polypentes means much suffering. Doesn't mean you suffer deeply, it means you suffer often. Homer never goes beyond a purely spatial or quantitative definition. He doesn't attempt to sound out non-physical things, because as far as he was concerned, they didn't exist yet. This had to be discovered. A software had to be invented. Okay, so what? Why does any of this matter? What I want to use this as an example of is the power of language. The power of words to create realities, subjective realities, realities in our individual reality tunnels, as they were called by Robert Anton Wilson. What this means is that if something as self-evident to us as the mind or the intellect didn't exist because we didn't have a word for it, then what kind of untapped potential is there floating around our universe for which we do not have a name, which we cannot bind to our usage because our language is limited? Something that we need to do as modern people, whether artists or not, is to push the boundaries of our language, because the way out is through. The way out of the prison of language. The thing which has trapped us in civilization, which has made it possible for us to be controlled by things like laws, by institutions propped up with paperwork, by treaties and contracts. The way out of this is by pushing language further and further while not getting lost in it. Understanding it as a tool and not as reality itself, but understanding that this tool is what sets the outward circumference or bounds of our thinking. Words are magic. As you speak, so you create. Governments know this. Marketing firms know this above everyone else. Every type of advertisement is a concerted stab at the heart of your understanding of the world. And we need to push these boundaries in order for us to avoid being controlled. Now, we've gone over our hour, so I'm going to end here, and we'll come back to this. So tune in for the next session. This has been the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, and I'm your host, Dan Atrell. Thank you.